totally affected my art. So growing up in the Soo, there was a lot of artists who were responding to the Group of Seven in different ways, because the Group of Seven, when they did their train tour in, I believe, 1921, they took the Algoma Central Railway out of Sault Ste. Marie. So there's train tours and lots of things around the Group of Seven, and so other artists that I grew up seeing were responding to that history in some way, which is a certain way of thinking about the landscape. But also being closer to nature was really important. So being able to access wild spaces quite easily as a kid was really important. And then I went to undergrad school in London, Ontario, which is much more urban and suburban. And then I went to New York City. And it's really when I got to New York that I went, okay, my experiences growing up are quite different than all these other people. And that's meeting people from all over the world. And I had friends from South America and different parts of Asia and Europe. And I would tell them how much snow there was growing up, and then that was pretty phenomenal. And then you're trying to explain to them, just what some of the animals are, like what a moose is. Like if you haven't seen a moose, it's not easy to explain. Or a beaver, it's this giant rat the size of a dog that chops down trees with its teeth and has webbed feet like a duck. Yeah. People are just like, what is that?
Like science fiction.
Yeah, so then I thought, maybe there's something there. And so that got me kind of interested in looking at nature, and that led to looking at landscape, but very consciously not wanting it to be the kind of representations that I grew up with, which was that Group of Seven, post-impressionist landscape tradition. And so when I came back from New York, I really started looking at all the different kinds of information I could find in the forest. So pieces of wood that were gnawed by beavers and mushroom spores, and I'm trying to think what else. I mean, I was looking at algae, like all kinds of stuff. And that was kind of my first foray into looking at the environment in a different way. And that led to a greater sense of environmentalism, and a feeling like if this is my subject, then I need to address some of the challenges that are facing these things. And so that eventually led to the interest in climate change. And growing up, the other thing about the Soo is that the Soo has an amazing music scene. So growing up, everyone had their own bands. It was really common. There was a good underground music scene. As kids, we would rent out halls and put on shows. And everyone seemed okay with that. Like nowadays it's hard to imagine like a 15-year-old renting a hall and then other teenagers bringing in cases of beer and nobody saying anything about it. Yeah. So, that was partly, it was the era, but it was also, I think there was kind of a can-do attitude, a DIY attitude that was fostered there, because if you wanted culture, you had to make it. That's right. And so that has been really instrumental in my work. So I think all of these projects, even though they might be becoming more sophisticated in how they're presented, it's still just me pulling these things together in a DIY kind of way. It's not, for Requiem, it's not a professional orchestra. It's an orchestra of volunteers. So there was an orchestra and choir that was made for the project, and it was environmental activists and students and just people who are curious about what it might be like to sing on a glacier. And so that side of things, that making your own posters, renting a hall, putting on those shows, generating your own culture, and being a cultural producer rather than just a cultural consumer was something that was important growing up. And we'd make our own comic books as kids, like all that kind of stuff. So I would say for sure that experience of growing up in Northern Ontario, the good and the bad of it, because it wasn't always easy for kids to be in that environment, especially during the recession in Northern Ontario in the 80s. It got pretty tough, but it also really fostered this sense of independence and creativity that I still carry with me all the time. So. I was definitely into music first, playing music. But I always had artistic thoughts, and like going back in my mind, I realized that some of these even unrealized projects that I had as a little kid, I didn't know what to call them. They were just kind of impulses I wanted to do, like create sculptural environments and stuff. And I asked my mom to help me, and she didn't really know what I was going for. But I realize now that those were all early creative impulses, and I can still remember them quite vividly. And I started drawing. I always drew, but I really started kind of drawing a little more seriously, probably when I was around 8. And that led to, and then that's coincided shortly after with this group of other kids in my class where we started drawing our own comic books, and we were pretty competitive about drawing. So I always took art classes because I liked it, but I always kept them separate. I always kept the art and music separate, even right through to grad school. So I was living in New York, and I decided that playing in bands was fun again, because I'd taken some time off while I was finishing up my art degree at Western. Got back and playing in bands. When I moved to New York, I thought this would be a great way to kind of get to know people and get to know people outside of my department and get to do some fun things. So, I looked in the Village Voice and auditioned for a couple bands and played in bands. At the same time, I was working at a gallery, and the gallery owner said, "Whatever you do, don't tell anyone that you're a musician, or no one will take you seriously. They'll think you're just dabbling in art." And I said, okay. So I kind of took that advice for a few years and kept them separate. And then I started getting these ideas that were musical, and I was listening to a lot of music in the studio. And when I came up with the idea for Northern Symphony, which is the first piece that I scored, where I'm translating beaver nod marks into a music score, at that moment I decided I'm going to bring these things together. And I was living in Northern Ontario. I wasn't in New York. I didn't have those pressures anymore. So I thought, it doesn't really matter what anybody else thinks, and at the time, literally no one was taking me seriously anyway, because they didn't know about me. So I was like, this gave me this tremendous sense of freedom to just do whatever I wanted. And that's what got me into bringing these things together. Well, so once I started bringing these things together, I really started looking at other interdisciplinary artists. So I thought, who are the people that do this? And, part of it was sound art was something that kind of happened in the late 60s, early 70s. It didn't really fall out of favor, but it just wasn't the focus. And in the 80s, there was a big resurgency of figurative painting and neo-expressionism, neo-geo, so this art that was about consumerism. And the sound art was kind of marginal, and a lot of art departments didn't have courses on sound art or anything like that. So I didn't really know about sound art when I started doing this, and so I didn't know that there was all these artists that were working in that intersection between the disciplines. But this is when I started doing some curatorial work, and I started thinking, well, I'm interested in these kind of artists. Let me start seeking them out and figuring out ways to try to work with them. And one of the early projects I did at Museum London was a piano project that I found that they had a Steinway that nobody was using. And so I got a grant to restore the Steinway and then invite artists who also played music to come and perform. And one of the people I invited was Michael Snow. And Michael Snow I started identifying some of these artists. And so Michael Snow was one for sure that was inspirational in the fact that he had a music career the whole time. And so that led me to find out about the Artist Jazz Band and CCMC, which is the group that Michael Snow was in, and all those artists. So it was a good contingency of Toronto artists. Found out about Fluxus. I was interested in John Cage through this whole time as well. And John Cage, I didn't know that John Cage had done visual arts. So John Cage did quite a lot of, later in his career especially, visual arts. But Of Weather, the piece that's upstairs, is dedicated to Jeff Hendricks, who is one of the Fluxus artists as well. Okay. And Jeff didn't take John Cage's class, but a whole bunch of the other artists that became Fluxus artists took a course called Compositions that John Cage was teaching at the New School in Manhattan. And it was for people who didn't have any experience composing. And that's when they started working with instructional scores. So where you give a group of instructions, a series of instructions to a performer, or a single instruction, or it might be even just a word, and they perform that somehow. And that Fluxus movement, there's a guy named Dick Higgins who was also in the class, who coined the term intermedia, which is looking at creating new disciplines that lay between existing disciplines. So sound art being at the intersection of art and music, but not either of those things. Performance art being at the intersection of theater and art. And then there's all these other ones, sound poetry and all these other things. So they were actively kind of trying to define these new medias. And so those artists were really interesting to me. But then there's a lot of, at a certain point, I realized that, what I was doing, I was creating sound and I was creating visuals because my background was as a painter. And that led me to realize, hey, there's a medium that combines sound and visuals, and it's called video. So that's how I started doing video. And then I started looking at other video artists as well. And people that kind of are non-media specific as well. So Pierre Huyghe is an artist, French artist, that was really inspirational to me. But also, in Ontario, Gordon Monahan, he ran a festival, or still runs a festival called Electric Eclectics. So finding Gordon, and I started curating an exhibition called London, Ontario Live Arts, which was a 3-day festival in London, Ontario. And that really gave me the opportunity to work directly with all these artists that I was interested in. So in a way, I got to test out, working on large-scale projections, but also really seeing how these artists work. So Tony Conrad from Buffalo was part of the Lamont's Young circle of drone music. So that whole, those type of artists were really quite inspirational. And then newer artists as well. Like when I started looking at Requiem, I started looking at all the different Requiems that I could get, So I started going to use record stores and going, oh, okay, here's, Benjamin Britten's War Requiem, here's Mozart's Requiem, and just collecting these things and listening to them more to get a sense of the sonority. Like what instruments are they using and how are they using them? And trying to create something that had that feel through that kind of orchestration. So it's immediately referencing those things without being them. Because I'm really coming at it from an art background and from a sound art background, and not so much as a classical composer, which I didn't have any experience doing. At the time, I had already been interested in climate change for over 10 years and quite urgently like worrying about it. And so I really felt that this is something I need to deal with, and really coming from a position of crisis. Like, this is a crisis that's going to happen, or it's happening, and people aren't aware of it. And so, combining that with, there's a crisis of land use. How are we using land? Who's using it? Why are they using it? What are they using it for? And that is being very detrimental as well. So that piece looks at those things from that perspective. It's not, super subtle to call something a requiem. It's implying death has already occurred in some way. So, and that's where I was coming from at the time. And I didn't really know the land that well, because I was still living in Ontario when that project was initiated. Then I moved to BC. BC was brand new. Now I'm much more interested in generating and promoting a culture of possibilities rather than crisis. So refocusing my mind and refocusing my creative output in a way to start thinking about, what does a future culture look like that is addressing decolonization, that's addressing reconciliation, that's addressing environmental concerns, and how does one articulate these things in a way that can help change the culture in a way. And I think all of these issues in some way are cultural issues. So rather than sitting back and waiting for politicians to solve all our problems, which they won't, because they have to be reelected every 5 years. So it's hard for them to make bold moves unless the population wants them to. And I see that all the time now. People are blaming politicians for this and that. But the politicians also have to do what everybody else wants them to do. So when they're continuing to log old growth forests, in a way it's because there's a social contract that people want logging to still happen, because they keep buying those products and your dollar votes. So that I'm more interested in, like, how can we address these issues in different ways? Because I think the method of talking about these issues is all about, it's all oppositional, and it's all about crisis, and it's all about fear. And obviously that's not super appealing to a lot of people. So I think finding ways to be more, culturally inventive, and looking at good models of being and promoting those, so that people are getting something. Right now it's all about, you need to stop driving a car. You need to stop buying these products. At the same time, late capitalism has consolidated so much into the hands of very few. Yeah. So I heard a quote, I don't know how accurate it is, that 70% of the calories being produced, it might be a little bit more, today are produced by 7 companies.
Yeah.
So that's kind of like, you end up with these monolithic companies that are really should be the ones responsible for a lot of what's going on, or they have the power to ship, but they will change if consumers demand that they change. But right now we're kind of, I think we feel like we're subjected to this stuff, and I don't think it's entirely fair to put all of climate change on the backs or on the hands of consumers, individuals. Consumers are people want to be good. People do their recycling. They're driving hybrid cars, or they're turning down the heat in the winter and stuff. So people are very mindful, of putting in heat pumps. Like, I hear people doing all these things all the time. So, and for sure, all these things make a difference. But these massive systemic changes that need to happen, it's kind of, that needs to come from a reframing of how we see ourselves and how we understand ourselves as human beings being in the world. And so I would say that is probably how I've shifted since Requiem. So looking back at it now, I see it as of its time. And I think it's still relevant, and obviously other people think it's relevant too, because it's still being shown 10 years later, which I'm very grateful for. At the same time, I'm kind of sad that these things have become these issues have become more relevant because the problems aren't getting solved, or they're not getting solved fast enough. And so when I'm looking back at it, that's how I feel seeing it. It's also, in some ways, that piece is a bit of a miracle. Like how it came together, the community organizing themselves around it, is extraordinary. So I have very fond memories. I'm still in touch with a lot of people that were involved in Requiem, and I keep coming back to the Kootenays to show the work because I feel a sense of responsibility and dedication to the community through that work. And I'm kind of the ambassador for that work, who's going out and sharing it with the world. So, any time I get offered a show, I want to show the work because of that sense of responsibility. One of the things I love about New York at the time, which is in the 90s, I was living in Brooklyn, and it was kind of like the Wild West. Like artists were moving there. They were basically setting up shop in abandoned warehouses and creating these living spaces within them. And there wasn't nightclubs. This is in Williamsburg, which is one subway stop away from Manhattan. There was no nightclub, so artists would open their lofts and have booze cans and put on art shows. So it had that DIY culture that I grew up with, in Northern Ontario. So that was kind of an affirmation that, if you want to make something happen, you just do it. And New York really has that, attitude that you show up in New York and you're meant to contribute in some way. At least it did then. New York has changed quite a lot. And it was also quite inexpensive to live there, which sounds insane today. So that was pretty magical. And then the other thing is I saw hundreds of art shows every month. So I developed a context for contemporary art and that was really the bulk of my education. I had great professors as well, and they would tell me to go and see things. So, that was really good too. But independent of that, I would go to as many shows as I could. I'd go to as many openings as I could. And at the time, a lot of galleries were in the same building. So you could go through one building and see 5 or 6 galleries, and go to another building and see 5 or 6 galleries. And, in the course of 5 or 6 hours, see maybe 50, 60 shows. And that allowed me to kind of develop a criteria of what was speaking to me and what wasn't speaking to me, but generally created a giant context for the things that I was interested in. So at the same time, it was kind of affirmational. It was also kind of a bit demoralizing on one level too, because you realize so many things had already been done. But coming to terms with that critical mass was kind of like being overwhelmed for a while. Kind of coming out the other side of it, I sort of recognized what things I could be doing that maybe hadn't been done or weren't commonly being done, and I started focusing on those things. And so it definitely was a way for me to start generating my own voice as an artist, even though it was kind of a long, painful process. So that I carry with me for sure. I'm not an artist who has a formulaic signature style. I think there's tendencies in the work that are recurring. And, at a certain point, like when I was starting out, it was like innovation, and I felt like each show had to be radically different from the next. Now I'm more comfortable with it being part of a continuum and taking some of the ideas that maybe weren't as well formulated when I first did them and bringing them into the present, and then updating them and going, okay, how can I honor this previous work and these previous ideas in the present moment and make them more effective, I guess, or improve on them. So I think, so there's that side of things. And on the other side of things, I'm always trying things I don't know how to do. So right now I'm trying to write an opera. Never written an opera. I wrote an oratorio, but haven't written an opera. So I'm always trying, pretty much all the time, attempting to do things I've never done before. So for me, my practice is a process of learning, and art is the instrument through which I am exploring the world, but also learning how to do things. And so I've got this rather insanely broad spectrum of techniques that's drawn from different disciplines that I draw upon in the work. And so I do feel that the work is developing, but I'm kind of a restless creative that isn't satisfied doing the same thing over and over again. I wish I was. My life would be a lot easier. And these crazy projects are, each time I'm like, oh, how do I outdo myself for the next one? Sean Kiley, who's a PhD student, he helps me doing some of the scoring. So, I'll compose something, and then he's helping me get it into the scoring software. And so he doesn't always give his opinions, but he will. And so there are people around me. I feel like there's a lot of people around me that have their own hopes for the work, and so which is interesting. And in this opera, there's a lot of collaborative elements to it. So the libretto I'm crowdsourcing information from people because I'm writing the opera about the old growth forest. So I'm talking to loggers, I'm talking to ecologists, and I'm interviewing them, I'm asking them questions, and the answers to those questions will become part of the libretto, or I'll be based in those answers. So I'm bouncing those ideas off, but also kind of pulling ideas together as well. So I sort of see my role as pulling things together and presenting it in an interesting way as well. And certainly when I get a little further into the project, whoever ends up conducting it will probably have their 2 cents, so it's inevitable that these things get shaped in some way by others. Yeah. It's going to sound a bit trite, but really don't give up. Don't give up, and don't talk yourself out of those crazy ideas. The ones that you like, because I think that happens all the time. You have an idea and you go, oh, that's going to be too difficult, or it's too weird, or whatever, and then we kind of talk ourselves out of those things. And my career really took a change when I stopped worrying about those things and focused on following those ideas, because that really ended up being the most exciting pursuits. It wasn't the easiest. It would have been a lot easier for me to just stick with painting. And I think that I was making a reasonable amount of money selling paintings and drawings. Making media installations is not as collectible, and it's not as easy. But I feel far more fulfilled as an artist doing that. So And the other thing I usually tell my students is to really look at the community around you. You know, your fellow artists, that's going to be your first point of connection to the art world. And it takes that community to really make it, I think the idea of the solitary artist in their studio, you need to make time to do that. But you also can't just do that. You need to get out somehow. Or you need to have supporters that are willing to do that for you. And it could be one of your classmates, it could be a fellow artist that becomes that person for you. So you just don't know.